Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we are talking about the power of food and our relationship with cooking. And joining us is New York Times bestselling author and speaker, Leanne Brown. Leanne was named one of Forbes 30 Under 30 and was listed among the most innovative women in food and drink by Food and Wine and Fortune magazines. This is an honor that recognizes visionaries who are working to change how we look at food. She has given talks to packed audiences in all sorts of different locations, ranging from universities, food banks, farmers markets, and community events in over 40 cities throughout the country, including South by Southwest. Thank you so much, Leanne, for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here from my bedroom.
I love it. To our viewers today, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section and we will get to as many as we can. Leanne, let's jump right in. So first, sure. I really want to just get a brief glimpse into your new book, which is sort of where this whole conversation is going to center, which is about relationship with food and emotion. So it's called Good Enough, a Cookbook. Could you just tell the audience a little bit about the book, sort of how you would describe it?
Absolutely. Well, I think the way you described it is certainly appropriate. And I think I would say almost more than being a book about, it's a book about cooking in our lives. And it's almost the way that we can use food and cooking, and really thinking of food and cooking and preparation as a way that we nourish ourselves and a way that we take care of ourselves that really is, very grounded in like something we need to do, something we have to do, and also something we get to do. All of those things are true at once. And the way that we approach it, whether it's with, joy and lightness and gratitude, or if some days, and it is all of the above, or if it's like with a sense of dread or frustration or exhaustion, all of these things, that it really does, all of that sort of comes into it. And when we notice ourselves sort of stuck, maybe in some type of particular pattern that we don't really want to be in, that makes it so that every time a meal is coming up, you're kind of going, oh, this again. Then I think that is sort of telling us that there may be something there that we can work with. Because I think that when we can find peace with the way that we feed ourselves, and that doesn't mean that every time it's going to be like magnificent and you're going to feel wonderful every time, but if we can find some sort of peace, some acceptance, then we also find acceptance of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I believe that makes its way into all the rest of our lives. And that's so important. It can be just a really beautiful place to practice being a person and being the kind of person that you want to be with yourself and with others. So it's really about relationship with yourself through food, and kind of about how we can use cooking and food really to help nourish ourselves in our body, and very much in our minds, and in all those connections.
Mm-hmm. As I was reading it, I was really thinking that it was almost multiple books parallel to each other at the same time. So you have the actual cookbook with recipes that you could follow and do yourself, just like any regular cookbook. But then you also have your own reflective practice going on throughout. And then it's also supported, by research and other things. But they're your ideas that you're struggling with, and concepts that other people are struggling with too. And I thought it was such an interesting read, and so different than any other book I had really come across, that you have these two parallel books that are pun unintended, feeding each other. And but it was a really fun read. And I was like, oh, I feel like I need to be reading this cookbook, in bed, almost like as I'm going to sleep. It's like the novel that I'm reading.
Yes, I've had people say that to me. My favorite was someone shared a picture of them reading it in the bath. They had like one of those things with like their beautiful little tea. And then I was just like, perfect. That is just makes me so happy.
That's so funny. That's excellent. So some of the concepts that you're covering, you talk about some emotional challenges in the kitchen. So I was wondering, just what do you think are some common emotional challenges that Americans have in the kitchen, and how are they manifesting themselves?
So my biggest sort of motivation for writing this book was, out of my last cookbook, was called Good and Cheap. And it was this amazing experience. It was actually started out as my thesis project for my master's degree. And it was a book that was focused on eating on a very, very low budget of around $4 a day at the time, which is sort of the average that a person on food stamps or SNAP has to work with. So it was very much focused on that kind of audience, this really underserved community. And it ended up being sort of a big success in a way that I was not necessarily prepared for, which was wonderful, but kind of overwhelming. And I found myself talking to so many different people. And I had this experience just over and over and over in so many different rooms and so many different scenarios of people coming up to me sort of gingerly and saying like, oh, I love what you're doing, but you couldn't help me. I'm the worst cook imaginable. Like I'm terrible. And it was always like, what a fascinating experience, because this is a person who has chosen to come to a cooking and food event to like meet a cookbook author and do this. And yet they feel compelled to also define themselves as this like really bad cook. And so I loved having these conversations. I mean, it broke my heart a little bit, but I loved having these conversations because almost always there was this moment where I felt like I could actually offer like some real relief to this pain that they were expressing, which maybe it sounds over the top, but to me, a lot of the time there was such a strong desire to have some level of not even mastery, but control, and that they were longing to have this joy of cooking and of feeding themselves. And yet something was in the way. And so much of the time it was honestly this big time self-criticism, often reflected from, so often it was someone would say like, oh, my kid just like hates everything I make. And it's like, hello, yes, all of us. So normal. That does not mean you're a bad cook. Or it would be like, I had this dinner party and like something bad happened. Someone didn't like it. Or, more heartbreakingly, sometimes it's something in earlier years where someone tells you, oh, I don't like your food, or I don't like sometimes it's like your sort of cultural food has been rejected in some way. Or there are all these experiences that people were bringing. And it was like, none of these are actually a reflection on you as a person, you as a cook, or really mean anything. And so I just knew like I wanted to write something for these people. And I found myself as I sort of went through that, and then I got pregnant and I had a really difficult pregnancy. I was really sick the whole time. And I found myself sort of relating to like so many different people, like finding myself going like, I also hate food now. It makes me sick. How do I cook for myself now? And just wanting to like cry out and hold hands with and connect more with like those of us who struggle, and to sort of know that there are no like people who love cooking, people who hate cooking, people who are bad, people who are good, like all this idea. It's like this duality that we have. It's like some days I make amazing stuff out of barely anything, and other days I'm like burning the toast and it's a total bummer. Like that is what home cooking is. Whereas and I think that so much of our and so the other reason was that I felt like there is this in our food culture, in whether it's TV or other cookbooks or everything, it's so much of it is from these people who are often chefs in restaurants, or who are cooking sort of for money, for others, for these sort of outside audiences. And I think that when we only learn how to cook from that kind of perspective, that's really not what we're trying to do at home every day. And especially when you're trying to feed a family or trying to feed just yourself, it can be really challenging when the only thing that you're really shown is sort of like how to make these restaurant meals. How do you really integrate that into like your real everyday life with all of its ups and downs? Some days are so difficult. All of the challenges that we go through, let alone, of course, the sort of classic like money and time ones that we've all heard and know and matter, of course, but that there's so much more to it. And I just wanted to bring more of that, not to overwhelm, but frankly, to validate why it often can be such a struggle for so many, and to try to go through. And so I realized over many years of developing this book that I had to speak from my own experience in order for it to be a sort of authentic expression of all of these issues. If I tried to, I initially thought like, oh, I'm going to tell all the stories of all these different people. And I realized there was no way to really tell other people's stories in the resonant way that I could with my own. So I had to kind of confront a lot of my own issues in order to get it out there. But I'm glad I did, of course.
So was that a really raw kind of challenging process as you're sitting there writing this book, thinking and reflecting upon your own struggles and then sharing it in such a public way? Was it, now that you have that and it's out there, is it something that like, you're like, yes, this is great. And I'm so excited to share, or is it just like, oh my gosh, this is a process that I just went through and I'm still sort of reeling.
That's a great question. It's a little of both. I think at
Mm,
this point, I feel I have had enough space with it. I wouldn't put anything in there that I was really like, ooh, if someone criticizes this, I'm gonna like fall apart. Like I would keep that for
right, right.
somebody. So most of the stuff, basically everything that I have shared is something that I really do feel like I have healed. I have a sense of, I feel okay about. I want to share it because in the hopes that like maybe it will reach someone who is in that moment that I was in at some
Mm,
point. They might feel a little bit of that and feel understood, feel encouraged, be able to sort of see a pathway. I think that so much of it is like so many of the people that we look up to and that we try to be like in some way, whether it's like a chef who makes beautiful food or just like even a parent, like trying to like be like your mom who you always idolize. It's like
right, right.
um, we we have this tendency in our culture, so many reasons for this, we don't even need to get into it, but that we tend to sort of show like the end result, like us,
Right,
I am now, this is me
right.
successful. And it's like, that's such a disservice to people who are trying to just like get through. It's like, I think it's so much more meaningful to show what the process really looks like of figuring out, and to show that it's also like never over. Like it's always this like never ending process that will change as your life changes, as your challenges change, as your family changes, as you go on to new and different, like this idea that we have that sort of like, oh, children like are going through a phase and they'll get over it. But once we're adults, we're who we are forever. It's like, no, that's not how it works at all. I
Right,
continue to go through phases as an adult as
right,
well. And I
right.
think that we all, can and should embrace that about ourselves,
Yeah,
um, and revel in it and enjoy seeing ourselves change.
yeah, yeah. So I was wondering, with all the people that you've connected with from your first book, and then also as you were going through this process, writing this second book, what was your take on particularly women's relationship with food? And then even to take a step further, becoming a mother and being a mother, a parent, and that whole piece, and those are two very, very different things, but yet I think thinking about culture, our American culture, which is such a hodgepodge of culture, but the role of being a woman around food and the traditional roles that women have held, but then also being a mother, and then the idea of women, looking a certain way or acting a certain way. I was just curious what your take was as you're grappling with food and emotion. Where do you feel like women and mothers fit into this conversation?
Oh, well, I definitely do feel, I mean, as both a woman, I identify as a woman, and as a mother, I usually say parent more just because I feel that in some way, that
Yeah.
meaning to that. But yes, basically, I mean, thank you for sort of making all the points that you just did, because I think basically, yes, I think that there are many, many struggles that are specific often to this gendered experience that we have as women and as mothers, because we are trained through our culture to take on certain roles. So it's like, because of the motherhood, like the sort of caring that that we are trained into doing as women and as mothers, to be sort of the holder of our family's cares, to be the nurturers of relationships, and to be the nurturers of our loved ones' bodies as well. We often, in sort of health and nutrition research, there's something called, like, they say, like, women, they really, as shorthand, like in research, use women and mothers as are the gatekeepers of nutrition in the family. This is like a given. And it's like, it's bizarre, really,
Mhm.
that is a given, and yet, of course, we're like, yeah, of course, because this is how we're socialized. And so, because if you are socialized and this is a role you find yourself identifying with, taking on, it's like we as individuals, of course, are separate from those roles. And so anyone and any of us can have those experiences. But I think when we step into that role as this nurturer, as the one who, cares for the bodies of ourselves and of our loved ones, there's a great deal of responsibility, and a great deal of pressure,
Mm.
sadly, like just tremendous, tremendous pressure, I think, that comes with it. And this is not even, I haven't even talked about like diet culture and,
Right.
and
Right.
like the way that women's bodies are scrutinized, and made into things instead of living vessels for ourselves. There, it's tremendously deep. And I just think that in general, because of the way we're socialized, it would be fair to say that women and mothers, but parents in general, are going to sort of have to confront some of these issues in ways that often don't feel good and that feel very pressured and scary. And we have to deal with the perfectionism of our
Mhm.
culture, sort of, that says, like, not only do you have to get dinner on the table, it has to be nutritious. And by the way, we're going to be constantly changing what that even means, and make it incredibly complex to figure out. And other people will be judging you and judging your parenting and your self based on these things. And also, and it's going to be expensive and confusing and take a ton of time. And also, you better like make sure everything's really clean, and you better also make it look effortless, and you better also like get everyone to the table and off screens and connecting in a authentic way with one another about our days. And it's just like we're supposed to do that in addition
Right.
to literally anything else. Like, it's so much, and it's profoundly unfair.
Mhm.
And I think that the way to begin to work with all of that pressure is to name it, laugh at it a little bit, maybe that sometimes helps me. And then also, yeah, I guess just begin what heals it is by going like, I can't do all of those things. And
Mm.
honestly, do I want to? Does one of us need to do that? I have some sections in the book, it's sort of towards the end, that's very much about cooking for others. And that this idea that sometimes when we imagine, and it's so much in it's in so many cookbooks and shows, this idea of like sort of appearing effortless. And it's like even the names of so many recipes, it's like easy this, effortless whatever, like how
Right.
to, like, basically it's like how to show off like and look like everything is so easy for you. And it's like that's such a fantasy, and it's such a sort of disservice, I think, to ourselves. I think especially, I have to say, to our kids, I think it's
Mm.
such a disservice to make something look easier than it is, because that is a lie.
Right.
And they're going to believe that, and they're going to go like, why is this so hard for me? Why am I not as good as
Mm.
mom? Like,
Right.
why did she find this so easy and I find it so hard? And like when we don't, and it's like it is actually a buffer to any type of intimacy, any type of real relationship, when we act like we have all our friends over and we're kind of like, oh, this was nothing, wiping the sweat, like for like 3 days straight. It's nothing. It's like it was something. It was a
Right.
deep, profound act of love, and it was
Mhm.
hard work, and you did it because you love them. And like they should know that,
Right.
like
Right.
there's something so intimate and beautiful about that. But it truly, like, I know, like the old, like me from a few years ago would like shudder at the like just vulnerability of that, like admitting like how much time and energy you sort of spend on connecting, on trying to connect, on trying to show your love through the form of cooking,
Mhm.
which is something that so many people, food and caring for others is like a sort of a love language.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think when we really can own that, and own that it's not always easy, it doesn't always flow effortlessly, there's something even more meaningful kind of about that. And I would like to see that sort of change, and to go like sometimes things are relatively effortless. Like it's also wonderful to just have friends over and just be like, dump out a box of crackers. Like, like it's great, it's all
Right.
good. But when
Right.
we do make an effort, which we will maybe choose to sometimes. I think to be really honest about that, I think is actually really brave and like really genuinely courageous and really beautiful, and will get us what we actually want, which I think like that connection and to
Right.
express our love. And I think when we can show that also in a family setting, and then in like our chosen family and in our community and all of that, I think it spreads out in a way that is really healing and important.
So I think that's a great piece of advice. Be more honest and transparent about the work that goes in. And then you also mentioned being sort of be kind to yourself in the process. And I was just wondering if you maybe had some, that's so easy to say, be nice. I was wondering if you had some tips or tricks, especially to parents who are struggling with so many different pieces. What would you recommend? Like, how do you be kind to yourself in the kitchen? And maybe especially to people who aren't maybe that comfortable in the kitchen to begin with. Like, what would you recommend? How do they grapple some of these emotions that they're feeling as they're
Sure. I
going?
think, oh my gosh, it's such a huge question. And I love like working with individuals about these things.
Mm,
Because it's so interesting to see like where people are at. I have this one friend who's sort of like genuinely doesn't like cooking, like really doesn't like it. It's not like I'm bad at it. It's like just doesn't enjoy the process, but he loves to like set food in front of others. Like he loves to care for people, but he just
huh,
doesn't like enjoy the whole process.
huh.
And and he has a daughter about the same age as our daughters are friends. And it's been so interesting to sort of see his transformation, because he really was carrying a lot of guilt. He was like, oh, I hate cooking and I'm so resentful about doing it, but I really want her to eat healthy and I like need her, like, oh, and I feel always like I'm failing. And it was just like self-acceptance, like
Mm,
meeting yourself where you're at. And so like his journey has been beautiful to watch, because now he's like, yeah, I don't like cooking, but I do like to be a person who has a plate of food for my daughter, because, and this is sort of personal, but um he grew up in kind of an erratic, like chaotic home, and often meals were just not there. And so for him, love, it's so important to show love by being always like being there. Like,
mm,
it may not be like all that fancy, but like I will always have lunch for you. I will always take, and when you are his guest, like you will feel like you are cared for. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And so I just so much have encouraged and worked with him and talked through like having pride in that and like leaning into that part, and accepting like it's totally okay to be a parent and be a person who just doesn't like to cook. That
mhm.
is okay. And then for those of us who do like to cook and have found pleasure but struggle with that, I think it's all about meeting ourselves where we're at and being really, really real with where we're at in our lives. So if we are parents, especially parents of young children, I think being realistic about, and we were talking about this briefly just before the call, but like when we have really young kids, there's just so much to do. And sometimes it's like, you feel like you have to make like 5 or 6 different meals a day, like just for the, and it's like there's just so much to do that it can
Mhm.
take the joy out of like getting to do that. Whereas you might have in the past gone like, oh, we could have dinner and just like chill and reconnect and have a glass of wine and
Right.
and that's beautiful. And I think, and if you enjoy that, you try to make time for that when you can. But the fact that you don't have that all the time is kind of disappointing. Um, but it also isn't a reflect. It doesn't mean you're like doing a bad. It's like not personal. Like so much of
Mm,
the way that our lives look, we often blame. And I have been this person forever. I blame myself. It's like, oh, why am I so grouchy with my daughter for like putting paint on the ground when I just cleaned that? And it's like, I should be able to handle this better. And it's like, well, I didn't, you know, I didn't. It really bothered me. And like, I can just say, oh, I'm sorry, darling. Let's clean it up together. Mistakes happen. I got frustrated. Let's work on this together. And when it comes to, yeah, with food, it's just like, and I think when you're really new to cooking and you're trying to kind of like build some new habits, it's really important to just set realistic expectations for yourself.
mm,
So rather than, and I think we have this tendency, and it often comes from such a beautiful place when we're like so excited, we're like, yeah, I'm feeling really motivated. I've got all these cool recipes. And you like go to the store and get like so much produce, and then life your regular life is still the same way it was last week before you made this plan. And then you're like, oh, I'm actually just gonna get takeout tonight. Or like, oh, this thing happened and I like worked through. And then, you 3 days later are looking at your produce and you're like, ooh, it's looking wrinkly. And I like didn't, and I can't even remember what I planned to make. Or,
Right.
like sometimes when we set the bar so high, it's not giving up to just do a little bit at a time
Mhm.
and meet yourself like really where you're at. It's like if you want to have more sort of like fresh meals, like pick like one night a week and like really commit to that and see how it
Mhm.
goes. Notice how it makes you feel. Like think about like all that it takes. And eventually like you're able to build habits so that you can have more of that in your life. It's like with anything, when we commit to it in time and slowly integrate it, it ends up just becoming a part of your life. And if you really value it, you notice how much it can give you, how much it
Mm.
can offer you. And then you can find ways to make that. And again, and then just like, yeah, the other thing is sometimes you're going to make something that is bad, like that
Right.
and that's like such an important thing. Like I think that's so much of the way that like every cookbook is written. Like this is why it's called Good Enough. It's like
Mhm.
it's about me, it's about the food, it's about everything. It is good enough. And you have to, it's like we need to, the way that you're kind to yourself in the most deep, true way is to always go, no matter what, it's good enough. No
Mm.
matter what. And so like before you even start the process, you go, I am here with myself, noticing my intentions to make something good for myself or for my family or whatever. And that is really beautiful. And I'm proud of myself for doing that. And that's growth. And that really matters. And then whatever happens, you still have something that's so good. And so even if it ends up like, despite your best efforts, things, it just was like not a recipe that really works for you, don't really enjoy it, then with yourself, you can go like, oh, well, I'll try again,
Right.
because you
Right.
had so much to hang on to that's good. And when it's with your family, I think also when we share the load, I think that can make that moment around the dinner table where if like one person is in charge of the whole thing and then it's a bit of a flop, that
Mhm.
person feel really criticized and hurt and like their love is rejected. And sometimes it can get pretty deep. But I think when everyone works together, you can go like, ha, oh
Right.
well,
Right.
that didn't work out. What are we going to experiment with next time? Like
Right.
maybe taking like one day a week where we're trying something new, and but really you have your like shed of awesome things that everyone likes, and that's what you usually do. And I think there's just so many ways that we can support ourselves. And really I think the number one thing is like our attitude and our intentions, and just like
Mhm.
that, not like, kind of also just like take it seriously. Like it really is a place where you have, I know I do. And I think so many other people really do have a lot of big feelings and are carrying around a lot of desire to make it really wonderful. And just like be gentle with yourself. Don't think like this is no big deal. God, I should like have figured this out 10 years ago.
Mm.
What am I,
Mhm.
like all those thoughts, like they just
Right.
kind of don't belong there because it is a big deal. It makes sense. Like food is something we take it from outside our body, we put it inside our body. It's really intimate. It's really meaningful. It carries so much. There's so much about that choice, and everything that goes into it and comes out of it that is meaningful. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we act like it's no big deal.
Right. Right. So we've talked a lot about big feelings, but all with from the grown-up perspective. I wanted to hear your take a little bit about children and how do we set our kids up to have a positive food relationship. And you know, there's so many different theories out there and ideas behind it. And you've talked about as a parent, there are all these challenges that we're working through. And then dealing with, a toddler or a young kid or even a teenager, like some of their food preferences are really intense. Like I'm only going to eat white food or I'm only going to eat fruit. Um,
Yeah.
what do you recommend or what have you found works for you in terms of how to prepare kids to have a just positive food relationship?
So I think the number one thing is your own, because if you have a positive one and you're working actively on it and you're modeling that, eventually, even if they're not even close to there yet and they're like learning all kinds of stuff at school and bringing home like funny ideas and you're like, okay, they're going to see it from you, and that's the thing that is going to last. And that's true, I think, that's my belief anyway, basically with all parenting things, is
Mm.
like we can't give anything to them that we don't embody ourselves. It's like that thing where it's like, I told you not to do that, and then you do the thing, like they're going to
Right.
be, I'm noticing that.
Right. Right.
That's how they're built, and it's a really cool way to be built. But it's makes it hard for us sometimes when you're like, I
Right.
want you to be better than me. Just doesn't work that way. So I think that is really working on it for yourself is the important thing. And then, yeah, but then like kids will trigger your stuff by the way that they respond. So,
Right.
and that, so I think with really, I only have a 5-year-old, so I have like only that experience. And she's definitely in the phase where she's really restricted the food that she's interested, she early on was like much more interested in a wide variety, and then she's gotten much more restrictive. And I think normalizing that, like and having patience with that, and that's a period that lasts a really long time, and actually for some adults like almost doesn't go away. We can get really stuck in that place, having a lot of fears and a really strong feeling of disgust in our body about unusual foods is a real thing. Like I
Mhm.
think that's the thing. It's like I think sometimes we can be dismissive of the kid going like ew about something, but it's like usually it's not made up. Like
Right.
it's like I think there's a sense of like, oh, they're being manipulative because like they ate that last week. But
Mhm.
it's like, but this week it's gross to them for some reason. And because
Mhm.
usually like when we look at, not to get to, but I find this really helpful. Millions of years ago, right? We like carried our kids around on our backs and we were like feeding them, like as we like hunted and gathered everything. And then once they began to walk and began to like move around and do their own thing, and we began to go like, oh, they can like go off into the woods and come back, they would be getting food for themselves. And the way that they don't die and eat poison by accident is by only eating those familiar foods that they're so used to. And so, and that's like a strong inbuilt thing in our ancestry and in our bodies to restrict so that we can stay safe. And the way that that looks is having this really strong disgust response. So like
Right.
kids are just like, they haven't caught up. And
Right.
same with us, like as all of us, we struggle with our very, very ancient programming, which doesn't really work in a modern setting, but it's still there. And so they have this strong disgust response to unusual foods. And it's just needs to be worked with gently, and know that they
Mm.
will grow out of it, and trust them. And not, I think we often deepen sort of difficulties around meal times by being like so frustrated that they kind of are showing up the way that they do, and thinking that it's
Yeah.
somehow a choice that the child is making. But I think it's almost never a real choice. And it's really that we feel like, oh my God, you're wasting food. And like, I was never allowed to be this way as a kid. And like, blah, and like all your stuff is coming up. And it's
Right.
like, they're a child. They literally, and like trust in their goodness and in their awareness and all that. Like I've seen my daughter changed so much, of course, over the 5 years of her life. And I've often been like, oh my gosh, is this like okay? Are we like doing something wrong? Should I like be reading these books? And almost always it's like that's the point where it's like, and now it's completely shifted. Something
Right.
totally different. And it's like they change so much, and we change too. And
Mhm.
I think that like we just being patient with them and believing the best in them, and like
Mhm.
trusting them. And so just like continuing to, and even if it's frustrating, just like basically just continue to offer like as reasonably wide variety of food as possible, at the same time doing it within reason. Like my daughter will like, basically cheese and bread in some form, like
Mhm.
quesadilla, mac and cheese, toast and cheese. I'm like, cheese sandwich. I like, I have that. And then I also have these other things here too. Yeah, if you want, and it's
Right.
sort of like it continues, it's a way to like continue to offer and like widen, and then just you slowly like work on widening that. And like
Mhm.
you're not gonna be like, kids, 14-year-olds are like, it's so cool to like go and eat sushi. Like they're gonna want to be cool like their friends and like eat sushi
Right.
too. So they're gonna,
Yeah.
slowly figure it out, and they'll be watching us. So
Right. Right. So modeling and patience with them, patience with the process, and
and
then
with
patience with
yourself.
yourself.
Yeah,
Right.
with yourself when you're like, like, because I know I've had those moments like in a restaurant where like my daughter, I'll be like, oh, I'm taking you to like a special thing. And then she'll like have a meltdown, be like, I don't want to eat anything here. I don't like it. And I'll be like, why does this make me so upset? And I think I'm like, because when I was a kid, I was not allowed to ever do that. Right. Like that would have been
Right.
so rude, so unacceptable. And I was just like, ooh. That's like, I, I'm needing help right now. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, Really quickly, I want to ask you one more question. So your first book was Good and Cheap, and How to Eat Well on $4 a Day, and then now Good Enough, a cookbook. These are such big topics, and topics that us as a society really struggle with in sort of different
Yeah.
sections. So I was just
Wait.
thinking, I was thinking like,
This to
what's
myself.
right. So what's the next giant project you're going to take on? Sort of what's next? And like, what are some other things that you've been kicking around ideas? And, sometimes I ask this question of guests and they're like, top secret, I'm not sharing with you anything, which is a totally valid response. But like, what are your sort of hopes and dreams for where you're going next?
I am really interested at the moment. I'm in sort of deepening some of the stuff from Good Enough around like this, our sensory experience with cooking. So I think
Mm,
some of it's like, we were talking before and you said you love cooking. I think that's wonderful. And there are many people who do, but there are also many people who don't. And I think that if we can I want to create basically cooking classes, and I don't know, there could be a book. There's like so many ways to go with this, but this sort of, call it meditative, call it like a way of approaching cooking that takes away the idea of like the outcome and focuses on the process and
mm,
focuses on the pleasure and the sensory sort of experience of how good it feels to learn and to play with food, and how much of that is possible when we cook. Like the focus on, taking deep breaths, and a class where it's like, we're going to make bread, but like, don't worry about it. You're not going to like go home and be like, oh, I'm a master of this bread. It's like, you feel good. It's like
right.
after, like, I want you to feel like after you leave a yoga class, just like, I
Mhm.
feel so much better. I took a lot of deep breaths,
Yeah.
and I listened to like the sizzle, and I felt like the splash of the like lemon juice on my fingers, and I loved the sound of the chopping, and I breathed, and I noticed that I was here and that it smelled so good. Because that's the thing, there's all that pleasure is available even when the outcome is not so good. It's like you feel so alive. It's so exciting. You get to like smell and taste it. Like there's so much sensory that is, and I think that's so important for us in, our, American culture, and in our, capitalist sort of culture
Mhm.
where everything is about a goal, everything is about achieving. And it's
Right.
like, we so badly need the balance of just spending time existing and like
Mhm.
eating and being comfortable with and enjoying like our human sort of animal body, and coming out of, maybe a whole day of like work where
Right.
you're so up here and so focused and so goal oriented, into like the rest of your senses, and noticing like how much that helps us be balanced and helps us come back and be able to kind of do the rest of our life. So I'm kind of trying to,
Mhm.
I guess, like develop some more like intentional, like therapeutic sort of approaches to cooking.
Mhm. That sounds really fun. Well, thank you so much, Leanne Brown, for joining me today. Thank you also to all of our viewers and listeners. Make sure that you visit Chesapeake Family for any up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on chesapeakefamily.com in both podcast and video format. I am Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.